By the 23rd century, Star Trek fandom had evolved from a loose association of nerds with skin problems into a full-blown religion.
And Scotty beamed them to the Klingon ship, where they would be no Tribble at all.
All power to the engines.
As country after country fell under its influence, world leaders became threatened by the movement's power. And so the Trekkies were executed in the manner most befitting virgins.
He's dead, Jim. He's dead, Jim. He's dead, Jim.
Finally, the sacred texts were banned.
The last copies of the 79 episodes and 6 movies were dumped on the forbidden world Omega-3, along with that blooper reel where the door doesn't close all the way.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Trek Talk live stream where I take a look at an episode of the original Star Trek series, both the episode itself and the making of it. Today, looking at, of course, The Trouble with Tribbles. This is episode 42 in production order. I'm going by production order, not by broadcast. Hello, Gwagnar. Hey, man, thanks for stopping by. Always good to see you. And as always, I will be reading from Mark Cushman's book. These are the voyages for behind the scenes information about the making of this episode. And of course, this episode doesn't really need much, as far as introduction. One of the most famous episodes, easily, probably. You could probably argue this is the most well-known or iconic episode, aside from perhaps The City on the Edge of Forever or Mirror, Mirror, I would think, or maybe Arena, where Kirk fights the Gorn. That's pretty famous. But this is one that's been referenced and parodied so many times. It's definitely a fan favorite. One of the most beloved episodes. Happy Canada Day. Is it I'm sorry, I don't know. Is there a holiday in Canada today? Happy Canada Day, then, I guess. I'm sorry, I didn't know. Okay, so let's just go ahead and we'll hop into this one. I'll read from Mark Cushman's book here. So this is from an NBC press release. Millions of parasites swarm over the Enterprise. Millions is a bit of an exaggeration, isn't it? Over the Enterprise and help Captain Kirk defeat a hostile empire in The Trouble with Tribbles on NBC's Star Trek. Guest stars are William Shallert as Nils Barris, Federation Undersecretary of Agricultural Affairs. William Campbell as Koloth, the Klingon captain. Stanley Adams as Cyrano Jones, and Whit Bissell as Mr. Lurie, Space Station Manager. The Enterprise receives a distress call from Space Station K7. Mr. Lurie introduces Kirk to Barris, who is out from Earth to plant grain on Sherman's planet. Lurie fears that the hostile planet Klingon plans to steal the grain. Jones gives Lieutenant Uhura one of the parasites called Tribbles to keep as a pet. More of the Tribbles appear and multiply. When some of them die from eating the grain, Mr. Spock and Dr. McCoy discover a spy among Barris's agricultural team. I'm not sure what role Spock plays in it, but okay. Again, giving away the whole plot with its press release. TV Guide put it more simply and better without spoiling the ending for its December 29th, 1967 issue. Captain Kirk, assigned to protect a vital grain shipment at a space station, finds that he has trouble with Tribbles. That's right, Tribbles, balls of purring fluff that live on grain and are incredibly prolific. Writer David Gerrold described his story as man against Klingon, man against man, and man against nature in the form of the Tribbles. The theme, Dorothy Fontana summed up, saying, David wanted to basically tell a story about how things that look soft and cuddly and non-dangerous can sometimes be the most dangerous thing you encounter. So looks can be deceiving, I guess, would be the theme, or something along those lines. Or assumptions are dangerous, or something like that. And perhaps the most dangerous thing to any species, good Lord, I can't read. To any species is overpopulation. This topic would be examined in great detail 1 year after this in the 1968 book, The Population Bomb by Professor Paul Ehrlich. Star Trek would tackle this same issue again in 1968 in a much less subtle way in The Mark of Gideon. And I have an interesting note about the Mark of Gideon that I'll get to later while discussing this episode. Assessment. The Trouble of Tribbles is one of Star Trek's most beloved episodes. Although it's meant to induce laughter, all the elements needed for a successful dramatic story are present. At jeopardy is the starvation of an entire world, the balance of power between good guys and bad, and an Enterprise invasion by an alien life form with a proclivity to breed. Not to mention Kirk has a headache. In this tale, espionage, territorial disputes, bureaucratic ego, and Tribbles all combine to create a story that is hard to categorize but impossible not to enjoy. Some may prefer Star Trek to be more serious, but who could resist falling in love with the Tribble? Okay, and Guagnar, oh, hold on. So something going on with my microphone? Is it like, am I roboting or something like that? Or is it giving out? Maybe I need to turn it up a little. There, I hope that's better. Okay, and it is better. Okay, good. So Gregner says, yeah, it's a holiday here. Figured it was appropriate since both James Doohan and William Shatner were Canadian. Sure, absolutely. And I'm trying to think here. Okay. So we'll just go ahead and get into this episode. All right. So the Enterprise is on its way to Space Station K7. Kirk, Spock, and McCoy are discussing Sherman's planet, which is the closest planet in this region of space. Sherman's planet is disputed as both the Federation and Klingons have an interest in it. Sherman's planet is undeveloped, and according to the terms of the Organian Peace Treaty, the planet will go to the government that proves it can develop the planet most effectively. And it's interesting to note this is the references, there's a couple of references in this to the Organian Peace Treaty, which of course is itself sort of an oblique reference to the episode Errand of Mercy, where, of course, the Klingons and Federation almost get into a war over the planet Organia. And this is, of course, unusual because, you know, there wasn't a lot of referencing of other episodes up to this point. Now, the previous episode, of course, had Harry Mudd in it again, so that was one. But still, it was kind of a rare for that sort of thing to happen. Then the Enterprise receives a Priority 1 distress call from K7 indicating an extreme emergency. So the Enterprise increases speed to the station, anticipating a possible Klingon attack. And this episode was written by David Gerald and directed by Joseph Pevney once again. Now, when they arrive at the station, there doesn't seem to be any serious problem. Kirk calls the station and asks for an explanation from the station administrator, Mr. Lurie, who asks Kirk to beam over and says he'll explain. So Kirk and Spock beam over to the station, and Lurie introduces them to Nils Barris, the Federation Undersecretary of Agricultural Affairs in the Quadrant, responsible for the development of Sherman's planet, as well as his assistant, Mr. Darwin. Now, Barris was responsible for the distress call, even though there was no emergency imminent, and Kirk is very irritated that the priority channel was used without justification, at least in his view. However, Barris argues it was justified as their shipment of grain, which is bound for Sherman's planet on the station, is being kept on the station, and Barris is convinced the Klingons will attempt to sabotage the shipment. Now, this grain, called Quattro Triticale, is the only grain that can actually be grown on Sherman's planet. And getting it there to begin growing crops is a big part of the Federation's plan to develop the world in order to lay claim to it, not to mention prevent starvation on the planet. Kirk reluctantly agrees to place a pair of guards on the storage compartments where the grain is stored, but Barris is outraged, saying that this is insufficient. But Kirk, who is already fed up with Barris, dismisses his concerns. He also orders that the crew can begin visiting the station for shore leave. Uhura and Chekhov beam over. They're among the first, and they visit the station. And in a bar, they meet Cyrano Jones, a merchant who introduces them to Tribbles, small furry creatures that make a trilling sound. Now, while Jones and the bartender haggle over the price of the Tribble, it begins eating some of the Quattro Triticale that Chekhov has left on the bar. Uhura is enchanted by the creature, and Cyrano gives it to her for free, arguing that once she shows it to all her crewmates on the Enterprise, they'll all be coming over the station to get a Tribble of their own. On the Enterprise, Kirk receives a message from Admiral Fitzpatrick, reminding Kirk of the importance of Sherman's planet and basically telling him to give Barris whatever help he asks for. Kirk is exasperated by this, but then Uhura tells him that a Klingon ship is approaching the station, and the Enterprise goes to red alert. However, the Klingon ship doesn't attack, and then Kirk receives a message from Mr. Lurie on the station, who informs him that the Klingon captain has beamed into his office. Kirk and Spock beam over, where they meet Captain Koloth, who assures Kirk that their intentions are peaceful. Koloth tells Kirk they simply come to the station for some shore leave and reminds Kirk that under the terms of the Organian Peace Treaty, Kirk cannot refuse the request. Mr. Lurie tells Kirk that he doesn't really want the Klingons around, but legally he can't really refuse them, so Kirk orders more security guards over to the station to protect sensitive areas and limits the Klingons' access to the station at 12 crewmen at a time. Now, back on the Enterprise, Kirk and Spock go to the crew lounge, where they discover that Uhura's Tribble has given birth to several offspring and has drawn a bit of a crowd. McCoy asks for one of the Tribbles so that he can examine its biology, and then she offers the rest of the Tribbles to the other crewmen there, and they pretty much all grab one. Kirk then speaks with Barris, who is furious that Kirk has allowed the Klingons on the station, convinced that they are plotting to sabotage the grain shipment, and accuses Kirk of not taking sufficient precautions to protect the grain. Kirk is totally fed up with Barris and goes to sickbay complaining of a headache. In sickbay, he sees that McCoy now has a bunch of Tribbles, nearly a dozen, even though Uhura initially only gave him one. And McCoy tells Kirk that over 50% of a Tribble's metabolism is geared for reproduction, and obviously they breed prodigiously because of it. Kirk sends another group of crewmen to the station for shore leave, but before they leave, Kirk warns them to be on their best behavior, as he doesn't want any incidents with the Klingons. To ensure that they behave themselves, he sends Scotty over to them. This is over Scotty's protests, as he doesn't really want to go, but rather wants to stay on the ship, but Kirk insists. So Scotty, Chekhov, and Ensign Freeman go over to the station and enter the bar, where Cyrano Jones tries to sell them more Tribbles, but they refuse. He then tries to sell Tribbles to the Klingons, but the Tribbles begin squealing loudly when they're brought near the Klingons, who find the Tribbles irritating and tell Jones to get away from them. Jones then tries to sell more Tribbles to the bartender, who produces a pile of Tribbles from behind his bar. Then one of the Klingons gives a monologue about how humans are like Tribbles, or humans like Tribbles because they're weak and soft. Chekhov is furious at this, but Scotty tells him to calm down. Then the Klingon admits that Kirk isn't soft, but he says that Kirk is a swaggering dictator with delusions of godhood. Chekhov starts to jump out of his seat to confront the Klingon, but Scotty again tells him to settle down and ignore the Klingon. Then the Klingon mocks the Enterprise, first calling it a garbage scow, and then saying that actually should be hauled away as garbage. This is just too much for Scotty, who slugs the Klingon and sparks a brawl as the Enterprise and Klingon crews begin fighting, throwing the entire bar into chaos. Now, back on the Enterprise, Kirk demands to know who started the fight, but no one is talking. He asks Ensign Freeman. Ensign Freeman says, "Yeah, I don't know. Don't know, sir." And he asks Chekhov, and Chekhov says, "Yeah, I don't know. Don't know who started it." Kirk's more than a little irritated, and he confines them all to quarters. Kirk then speaks with Scotty and asks Scotty to level with him and reveal who started this mess, and Scotty admits that actually it was him. Kirk demands to know why, and Scotty reveals that he started the fight by striking a Klingon that called the Enterprise a garbage scow after he had already insulted Kirk repeatedly. Kirk then tells Scotty he's confined to quarters until further notice, and Scotty is thrilled since that's where he wanted to be all along. Now, in sickbay, Spock and McCoy discuss the Tribbles. Spock sees them as useless and a growing problem because they continue to consume lots of the Enterprise's food stores. McCoy argues that it's a human trait to be fond of cute, furry animals. And Spock dismisses this, noting that he's inundated with human traits constantly. McCoy then tells Spock that he likes Tribbles more than he likes Spock. Spock responds that while he doesn't care for Tribbles, he does appreciate that they don't talk a lot. Now, Kirk goes to the bridge, and he finds it filled with Tribbles. He even finds one in his chair. He calls McCoy to the bridge and confronts him with the Tribbles. McCoy tells Kirk that the Tribbles are basically born pregnant, as he puts it, and that they can reproduce practically at will. Spock then tells Kirk that the Tribbles will continue to consume their food and at their current rate of consumption will eat all of it, and notes that they are providing nothing in return. Uhura argues that the Tribbles give them love, but Kirk says he wants the Tribbles rounded up and removed from the ship. He then beams over to the station to confront Cyrano Jones regarding the Tribbles. Spock notes that by removing the Tribbles from their natural habitat, he has created a potential disaster. Then Barris and his assistant Darwin arrive, and Barris is furious with Kirk, arguing that he is taking the Sherman's Planet development far too lightly. Kirk counters that he takes Sherman Planet very seriously. It's just Barris that he takes lightly. Barris then tells Kirk that Jones is probably a Klingon agent and may be conspiring with the Klingons to target the grain shipment. Kirk asks what they base this accusation on, and Darwin notes that Jones's ship has been near Klingon space recently. Kirk and Spock dismiss this since Barris has no real evidence to support his claims. Now, back on the Enterprise, Kirk and Spock go to the lounge to eat and find the place crawling with Tribbles, even inside the food dispensers. Kirk tells Spock that he wants the Tribbles off his ship. He doesn't care what it takes. Then Scotty arrives and tells Kirk that they're getting into the ship's mechanisms as well, probably through the air vents. Spock then notes that the station has similar air vents on the station, including in the storage compartments. So they beam back to the station to check the compartments, and they find them all filled with Tribbles that have gorged themselves on the grain. Kirk winds up literally buried in them. Now, then McCoy arrives. Oh, well, actually, first, Barris is outraged, telling Kirk that he'll have Kirk's command for letting this disaster happen. And then McCoy arrives and tells Kirk that if they just stop feeding the Tribbles, they'll stop reproducing. A little bit late for that, of course. Then Spock notes that one of the Tribbles is dead. McCoy scans the Tribbles and says that a lot of them are dead. Spock suggests that there must be something in the grain that is killing them, and Kirk orders McCoy to study the dead Tribbles and find the reason. Now, later, Kirk and Spock are confronted by Koloth, who demands an apology from Kirk for the treatment of the Klingons he claims have received unfair treatment while on the station. Then Jones is brought in to be questioned regarding the Tribbles and the grain. However, before Jones is questioned, Koloth asks that the Tribbles be removed. Kirk tells a pair of guards to take them away, but as they leave the room, they cross paths with Darvin at the door, and the Tribbles begin squealing loudly. Jones says that he's surprised by this, since Tribbles like everyone, noting that they've only ever done this once before in the bar when they were near Klingons. Kirk places the Tribbles near the Klingons in the room, and they begin to squeal again. Then he places them near Spock and Barris as well, and this provokes no reaction from the Tribbles. Then he places them near Darvin, and they begin to squeal once more. Kirk tells McCoy to scan Darvin, and McCoy announces that Darvin is, in fact, a Klingon. Barris is dismayed to discover that his assistant is a Klingon spy, and further shocked when McCoy reveals that the grain shipment was poisoned. Kirk then questions Darvin, and with some persuasion from the Tribbles, admits that he poisoned the grain and that Jones and the Tribbles had nothing to do with it. Then Kirk tells the Klingons to leave the quadrant, noting that he's beginning to actually kind of like Tribbles. Now later, Kirk and Spock tell Jones that he has a choice. He can spend the next 20 years in a rehabilitation center, or he can clean up every Tribble on the station, which is now completely overrun at this point. Jones says that could take years, and Spock tells him, yeah, it'll be about 17.5 years. And Jones reluctantly agrees. Now, as the Enterprise departs, Kirk notes that there are no more Tribbles on the bridge and asks McCoy where they went. McCoy says that Scotty was responsible, but when asked, Scotty says that it was actually Spock's recommendation. Spock then says it was actually Scotty who performed the procedure, and at this point, Kirk demands to know where the Tribbles went, and Scotty admits that he beamed them onto the Klingon ship, where, in his words, there'll be no Tribble at all. And everyone has a good laugh, and the episode ends there. And A+, of course. Couldn't be anything else, really. Okay. Let me get that out of there. There we go. All right. So, after producer Gene Kuhn invited David Gerrold to think about some story ideas that could be done within Star Trek's restrictive budget, the aspiring writer told his mentor that he was toying with a story dealing with prolific fuzzy creatures. He remembered Kuhn saying, "That sounds cute, but it would probably cost too much. We'd have to build a creature, so think of something else instead." Now, in March of 1967, after Star Trek had received its series pickup, Gerrold submitted 3 story outlines: The Protracted Man, Bandai, and, despite Kuhn's previous refusal, The Fuzzies. Gerrold said that any other writer would have said, oh, well, it's a dead end, but I'm going to write it as an outline and show them how it can be done. In this original story outline of The Fuzzies, the setting is not on a space station, but instead on a small colony on an undeveloped planet referred to as a trading post. The characters that would later become Nils Barris and Arn Darvin are here, but they have different names. Damon Jones, who would later become Barris, is assisted by his twitchy assistant. And they have purchased a large quantity of grain, which is stored in warehouses at the trading post. He was planning to ship the crop to the planet Barth. The Barth Corporation, which owns 40% of the planet's usable land, doesn't want Jones's grain. They have grain of their own, which the corporation is making a nice profit from, and therefore they file an official protest with the Federation that the grain Jones wanted to send to Barth could, quote, destroy the ecological balance of the planet. In other words, they don't want the competition. Jones feared the Barth Corporation will sabotage his crop. The Federation, on the side of free enterprise, get it, sent Kirk with orders to safeguard the grain until it could be shipped to Barth. Now, once there, Kirk authorized shore leave for his crew. Now, in this original story treatment, it's actually Janice Rand who comes to the beams down, meets Cyrano Smith, and is the first one to receive the fuzzy in this case. And they're described as small balls of fluff that vary from tennis ball size to volleyball size. They have no legs, no eyes, just small, soft mouths. When stroked, they throb and purr. They move by pulsating and flexing their bodies, or by rolling, depending on how far and how fast they want to go, and only had two senses, a heat detection sense and a sense of smell to detect food. Smith was selling his fuzzies to local storekeepers, who in turn are selling them to those visiting the trading post. Rand gets one and takes her fuzzy back to the Enterprise. Now, almost immediately, the fuzzies begin breeding at an alarming rate, both on the planet and on the ship. McCoy dissects one and discovers that they are asexual and can reproduce at will. And they manage to get into everything. The ship's cook complained that fuzzies had gotten into his flour stores. There's one scene where Kirk and Spock look into the Enterprise's huge flour bin, and they see no flour, only a, quote, seething mass of fuzzies. The grain bins at the trading post also wind up being emptied of grain, but filled with fuzzies. Next, the Enterprise would pursue Cyrano Smith, who flees in his small scout ship. He's apprehended and returned to the planet on charges of tampering with interstellar shipments. However, they soon discover that the fuzzies who ate the grain are dead. Tests reveal a virus in the grain, and we find out the fuzzies starved to death in a warehouse filled with food. Smith recognized Jones's assistant, this is Cyrano Smith, as being an employee of the Barth Corporation. It was then discovered that the assistant had infected the grain and he was taken into custody. As for Smith, Kirk chooses a punishment to fit the crime, as Smith must stay at the trading post until he has rounded up all the fuzzies. Although different than the classic episode, the basic plot points of The Trouble with Tribbles are present. Some of the characters and plot turns are already in place as well. Gerald didn't hear back from Coon's office until the following June, at which time he was called in for a meeting. Gerald remembered Coon saying, quote, "I'm not buying your story yet. I'm only interested in it. You haven't written the kind of outline that I'll buy. That's what we're going to talk about." Janice Rand, of course, had to be removed. And Coon didn't want any references to corporations. His hand-scribbled note on Gerald's story treatment said, "Big business angle out. One planet against another instead." Gerald was invited to try again with the understanding he was not being put on assignment to write anything, only that whatever he wrote would be read. Days later, on June 13th, Gerald turned in his second try, now with the stranger title of "A Fuzzy Thing Happened to Me." The interstellar trading post now had a name, Topsy. And Gerald offered the idea that it could remain a frontier town for cost purposes or be a space station. Let me take a drink of water right quick here. Hold on. Okay. Where was I here? Okay, so there was more urgency in the beginning, with the Enterprise receiving a distress call from the trading post. Now, once there, a new character is introduced, Mayor Lurie, who is the owner of Topsy, which I guess is the trading post. The character of Damon Jones has now been renamed Nils Barris. Despite the name change, the character, however, is still a farmer turned businessman. and fears that his competitors are trying to sabotage his crops. The grain is now identified as triticale, a hybrid of wheat and rye. Barris's twitchy assistant now has a name as well, Arn Darvin. Rand was out, and Uhura, along with Sulu, was among those who embark on the shore leave, encountering J. Damon Cyrano, who would later become Cyrano Jones. Uhura is given a fuzzy and returns to the Enterprise with it. New to this version of the story, Barris becomes distressed when a private ship of his competitor named Joseph Mackey arrives, and Kirk confronts Mackey, who is described as a pure villain type. Kirk likes him even less than Barris and posts guards around the warehouses containing the grain. Meanwhile, as in the previous draft, the fuzzies were multiplying. Now, new here, there's a fight breaking out in a bar at the trading post between Kirk's men, including Scotty and crewmen from Mackey's ship. The fight starts when one of Mackey's men makes a derogatory remark about Kirk. From there, the story evolved much as it had in the previous draft. Kuhn sent the outline to Dorothy Fontana for her evaluation. She responded, quote, "I agree wholeheartedly that this story is one we should purchase. It needs more action, especially on Kirk's part, but it is overall different, thoroughly plausible, shootable, and most importantly has the elements of fun grounded in serious problems for our principles. The same sort of formula that made Shore Leave so well received. Even though we are actually overbought, I would recommend purchasing the story only and have another writer do the teleplay. I would even prefer to see the story done in lieu of a couple of the ones we now have on assignment because of its difference and its charm. It is, in my opinion, a story we cannot afford to lose this season." 40 years later, as she spoke to this author, and amused Fontana recalled, quote, "David still quotes it, that I wrote, 'This is a nice story, but I think we should give it to a different writer.' But Gene Kuhn said, 'I like this story and I'm going to let the kid do it.'" Gerald was called in for another meeting. Kuhn reiterated that the plot point of small business against big business had to go. His note to Gerald, "There must be a force hostile to the Federation in this area." Having seen Errand of Mercy a few months earlier, Gerald asked if he could use the Klingons as the hostile force. Kuhn, who was the creator of the Klingons, liked that idea. Changing Mackey's yacht to a Klingon battlecruiser gave the story the danger element it lacked. And I think this is why you get the repeated references to the Organian peace treaty in the episode, because Gerald had recently seen Errand of Mercy, so Organian, all that was in his mind, I guess. DeForest's research informed Kuhn that Gerald had not invented the name Triticale, but it was a true hybrid developed in Canada. Hey, happy Canada Day indeed. Kuhn told Gerald, "Then let us invent a vastly superior improvement." Their solution, Quattro Triticale. Gerald's third attempt with a new title, now called A Fuzzy Thing Happened, provided a suitable blueprint for the classic episode it would become. Like Quattro Triticale, Gerald's 24-page treatment was a hybrid of sorts in its own right, part outline and part teleplay. Gerald intentionally wrote certain sections of his outline in screenplay form in order to demonstrate to Kuhn that he could structure scenes and write dialogue suited for Star Trek. By this time, he was confident Kuhn would buy the story, but he wanted a chance at writing it as well. Many scenes that made it into the finalized episode are present. The fight in the local bar and grill, it had yet to be determined if it was going to be a planet settlement or a space station, was now between the Federation and the Klingons. Scotty throws the first punch because the Klingons have insulted the Enterprise, calling it a sagging old rust bucket. The delightful scene where Kirk disciplines his men, then speaks to Scotty and discovers it was he who started the fight is also here, although shorter and not as fleshed out as in the episode. And while opening a door to the storage compartments, a great mass of fuzzies fall out, burying Kirk. Also, for the final scene, Scotty admits to Kirk that he transported all the fuzzies from the Enterprise to the Klingon ship. Let's see. Now, Gerald was a fast writer and a hungry writer. This was now his fourth draft of the story. And he was doing this all for free, by the way. He hadn't been paid anything yet. He later revealed, finally, Gene Coon bought my outline. He had been about to hand it back to me for one more rewrite just on the last 2 pages, then changed his mind and just took it. Coon's words via Gerald, hell, I'll buy it now and you can bring in the 2 pages tomorrow. Having paid Gerald $650, Coon could now submit the story to NBC for its approval. Even though Fontana's ideas had yet to be included, Stan Robertson was jubilant and wrote to Coon, "This is an excellent story. The writer has shown great imagination and grasp of our series. The touches of humor with the underlying and very evident threat of jeopardy are superbly played against one another. If the screenplay is as successful as the story outlined, this should be one of the most visually exciting and provocative Star Treks ever put on film." Unquote. Gerald recalled, Gene Coon said, "We're not going to assign this to a writer for 2 weeks. So if you brought in a script version before that time, we would, of course, be willing to read it." Gerald didn't feel Coon was being unfair. According to him, quote, "It was necessary. It would have been unfair if he had tried to do it to me a second time because he was buying a second script from me. That meant he knew I could deliver a finished product and was asking to see one on spec. Only so long as I was unproven would I be required to prove myself this way. 2 weeks was and still is the normal amount of time given to a writer for a first draft script." Coon wanted to see if Gerald could write like a pro at the speed of a pro. But Gerald was actually faster. He delivered his script just 3 days later. It was 61 pages long, which is very long for a first draft. Coon called Gerald in for a story conference. He had scribbled notes across every page. Among the notes he made, "Let's establish better that the Quattro Triticale is of extreme importance to the Federation. Let's make Kirk stronger, more in control, and give more explanations, reasoning, and decisions." Okay, now Coon gave Gerald a 6-page memo from Robert Justman, prompting Gerald to later say, quote, "Justman presented one of the friendliest demeanors of the lot, but don't let his looks fool you. Behind that warm, fuzzy exterior, there lurked the heart of a miser. You would have thought you were spending his money. And vicious? Well, no, not really, but anyone who could send a 6-page, single-spaced, 1,000 words to the page memo to a brand new writer listing in glaring detail all the faults in his first round script or first rough draft script is the kind of man who would sacrifice Girl Scouts before a giant statue of Mammon, the god of money, while cackling gleefully and muttering arcane verses." The feedback wasn't all critical. Gerald had wanted to set his story on board a space station, but was told this was too expensive. Robert Justman, however, gave Gerald a present, writing, quote, "I like the idea of having this trading post within the confines of a space station. We could probably get a miniature space station built and photographed, and then we would have something we could use for future shows." Regarding Doherty, a young crewman that appears in the trailer and then again during the fight with the Klingons, it is was Justman's idea to change this to Chekhov, creating yet another plum role for the new series regular. Okay. Coon had notes as well. He liked the scene where Kirk finds out Scotty threw the first punch, but Gerald had neglected to milk it enough. Coon wrote, "Get some fun out of this. Like every man's entitled to his own opinion." Joke being that he didn't get real mad when Kirk was being insulted and only flipped out when the Enterprise was. And Coon was still unhappy with the climax. That Darwin was revealed as a spy because Cyrano recognized him. In his note to Gerald, he wrote, "Let us somehow determine that Darwin is a Klingon agent. This will mean making something more of him, somehow get the goods on him." Gerald later said, quote, "Almost at the last moment, I realized I know what the script needs. It needs a connection between the Klingons and the Tribbles. That's how we figure out who the Klingon spy is, because the Tribbles don't like the Klingons and the Klingons don't like Tribbles. It just came to me on the spur of the moment that I hadn't tied these two separate stories together." Another change that was needed was for Gerald to come up with a different name for the creatures. DeForest Research notified Kuhn that science fiction author H. Beam Piper had written a book called Little Fuzzy about the discovery of fur-covered creatures called fuzzies. Although the 1962 book had nothing to do with purring balls that multiply at an alarming rate, Desilu Legal rightfully wanted the name changed. Yeah, I think the fuzzies, I think they're like some kind of cat-like creatures, if I remember right. I've never read it, but it seems like I remember seeing the book or the cover or something like that. Not sure. Gerald compiled a list of cute-sounding names, including, among others, Shaggies, Gollies, Goonies, Roonies, Willies, Puffies, Poofies, Tippies, Tribbies, Triblets, and Tribbles. Of these, he was least bothered by Tribbles, and the name gave him an idea for a new title. And the script's new title became You Think You've Got Tribbles. There was one more hurdle to cross. DeForest Research also discovered that Gerald's script shared one similarity with a 1952 book by Robert A. Heinlein called The Rolling Stones, which I assume has no connection to the magazine or the band. The story took place on Mars and features a fuzzy little creature being raised as a pet by an Earth boy growing up there. The small animal is called a flat cat. It produces a soothing vibration when petted, and it is born pregnant. Quote, I thought David Gerald's troubles with Tribbles was loads of fun, Pete Sloman of DeForest Research said. Quote, we did, as you know, if you read the story notes on that, check with Heinlein. Joan Pierce said that she talked to Heinlein, and he said that he had no monopoly on cute, fuzzy critters. In other words, if you do this, I won't sue you. It was Joan Pierce's job, however, to report the similarity to Gene Kuhn. Now, Gene Roddenberry has claimed that he was the one who talked to Heinlein and that Heinlein agreed to let it go, saying that both Gerald and himself both owed something to writer Ellis Parker Butler, who's the author of a 1905 short story called Pigs is Pigs, which I'm not familiar with, so I don't know what that's about. Let me see. Let me check that. Let's see if I can figure out what is Pigs is Pigs about. I probably should have done that before the stream. Pigs is Pigs. Okay, so Pigs is Pigs, a story by American writer Ellis Parker Butler, first published as a short story in American Illustrated magazine. Pigs is Pigs went on to dozens of printings as a book and in anthologies over the next several decades. This sounds vaguely familiar. Pigs is Pigs. Railway agent Mike Flannery wants to change the livestock rate for a shipment of 2 guinea pigs and refuses to accept the lower pet rate, saying pigs is pigs. Flannery believes that the guinea is an indication of the pig's national origin. He argues that they should bear the higher freight charge of 30 cents for livestock rather than the lower 25 cents for a domestic pet. In support of this, he submits that if they were okay, well, he's got a couple of words here I can't say on YouTube probably. Then there would be no question of the animal's status. Because the customer refuses to accept delivery, Flannery is forced to feed and house what he now calls the pigs in his office. When he eventually receives instructions to accept the lower price, he discovers that the customer has moved. He is then instructed by his superiors to return the pigs to the company warehouse. By this time, the guinea pigs have now reproduced exponentially in Flannery's station house. After returning all the descendants, Flannery resolves to charge the lower rate for any future livestock. Okay, so it's sort of another story about creatures kind of breeding and getting out of control, I guess. Interesting. That title sounds vaguely familiar. I feel like I've heard of it before. Okay. So Kuhn bought Gerald's script and gave him more notes, then advised him to proceed to the second draft. Gerald later expressed, just as the premise went through 2 versions and the outline went through 3, so the script would go through a series of changes. Each time it would get a little bit closer to what we wanted it to be. Gene Kuhn never once told me what I had to do. Instead, he kept telling me what I couldn't do, and that it was up to me to come up with something that fit. We need something here, he would say, and then I would start spewing ideas until he heard one he liked. 3 weeks later, on July 19th, Gerald's second draft appeared. At 71 pages, it had evolved from corporate treachery to a story of espionage and the perfect vehicle to comment on the Cold War between Russia and America. Although a serious theme, the tone would be anything but. Quote, "We didn't set out for it to be a comedy," said Gerald. "As the script went through a number of drafts, we started putting in more and more jokes. Everybody was saying, let's just have fun with it." Now, Gene Roddenberry, as Gerald remembers, was not present when Tribbles was evolving from a light drama into an all-out comedy. He said, quote, "Roddenberry was out of town, which I think was one of the reasons Tribbles turned out so well. He is a meddler, and he couldn't let a script go across his desk without changing it. Now, a lot of what he did was good, but he's not what you would call a funny guy. He's not a man with a sharp sense of humor. If he'd been there, Tribbles would not have been funny. There would have been that heavy seriousness about it. And the whole point of the episode is that it's charming and funny. Roddenberry could never have been lightweight, charming, fluffy, or funny in that way." The decision to push the comedy was Gene Kuhn's. Gerald said, quote, "More than anything else, I needed guidance, personal tutelage, if you will, and Gene Kuhn worked closer with me on the Trouble with Tribbles than most collaborators would have. If it were up to me, Gene Kuhn would be titled to at least half the writing credit for this episode." Okay, so now next here, so he had done this draft, and he turned it in. But apparently, now after they approved a draft, it went to the studio's mimeo department or printing department to write up the actual teleplays, like that were going to be given to the actors and the director and everything. Now, apparently, Gerald had the margins for his typewriter set differently than they normally would be because he was new, I guess. So when it went to the mimeo department, they changed the margins to print up the teleplay. And when they did this, it extended the script out to about 80 pages. And an 80-page script would lead to an episode that would be about an hour and a half long. So this was way too long. And at one point, I guess Gerald came into Kuhn's office to speak with him, and he wasn't there, but he saw these scripts there. And so he took a look at them and saw how long it was and realized, oh, this is going to have stuff cut out of it. So he took this script, one of the scripts, and he went to the set where this was during the filming of The Apple. And he was just sitting in a chair watching them filming the episode, and he went through and started cutting stuff. Now, after he was done, he went back to Kuhn's office. When he got there, Kuhn was there, and Kuhn said, "This script is way too long. It's going to have to be cut." And then Gerald handed him the script and said, "I already made cuts." And apparently Kuhn was not happy about this because it was not, Gerald didn't have the authority to make that decision on what was going to get cut and what wasn't. And he was apparently a bit miffed about it. But he was also kind of worn out and he just kind of let it go and was like, okay, fine, whatever. He did make a few additional cuts, though. Okay, now Joseph Pevney returned to direct, and like Mark Daniels on I, Mud, was surprised when he was handed the script. There's a lightness to the writing not present in any other Star Trek script, a sense of humor that is not just entertaining to read, but helpful to director and actors. For example, for the character of Koloth, Gerald wrote in his script, "Koloth is the Klingon commander, and like the last Klingon commander that we saw, he is an evil-looking SOB. One has to only look at Koloth to know that he hates dogs, children, and is generally up to no good." For the Klingon commander, Kuhn wanted to bring back John Colicos, who played Kor in Errand of Mercy. He felt a recurring adversary for Kirk would be good for the series, but Colicos was unavailable to take the job. So Kuhn instead called another actor he was fond of who had worked on Star Trek before. And let me see. Here we go. William Campbell, who had played Trelane in The Squire of Gotho, said, "When I walked into the meeting, they asked me what my conception of Captain Koloth was. I told them, let me put it this way, I would never let anyone else hurt Kirk because I've got to be the one hurting him. In fact, I'll never kill him because I want to make him suffer." They said, "That's exactly what we want." Campbell, who was 43 at the time, worked steadily in TV and film, usually as 1950s and 1960s contemporary punks or thugs or villains in the Old West. Campbell had prominent billing in big screen hits like Escape from Fort Bravo, Man Without a Star, Backlash, and the Elvis Presley film Love Me Tender. Kuhn knew Campbell from an episode of The Wild Wild West where he had again played a villain, and Kuhn was the producer. Campbell would return as Captain Koloth in Blood Oath, an episode of Deep Space Nine. Stanley Adams as Cyrano Jones was 52. Let me see. Yeah, there he is. And he was in the middle of a quarter-century acting career with 200 roles in movies and on television. He appeared often on westerns like Wagon Train and Gunsmoke. He would return to Star Trek, but not as an actor. Instead, he would write the episode The Mark of Gideon. So it's interesting that he wrote that episode because, of course, it's about overpopulation, about people breeding out of control, when his guest appearance on the show is in an episode about these aliens breeding out of control. So you have to think he probably got the idea maybe while working on this episode. I don't know. Joseph Pevney said Stanley Adams was a good comic, and they didn't see him in that role at all. They said, "Oh my God, no, you're kidding." But Stanley was funny. He was funny in that show, and he had a wonderful, broad, heavy humor. Now, they've got a photo of him here. Apparently, he was on a couple of Batman episodes where he played a member of the Gotham police force. Now, David Gerald helped plant an idea into the minds of Joseph Pevney, Gene Kuhn, and Joe DaGosta regarding the casting of Arn Darvin, the assistant to Nils Barris. In the script, Gerald wrote how an irked Kirk tells Barris, "You issued a priority 1 distress call because of a warehouse of wheat." And Darvin injects himself into the conversation, correcting Kirk by saying "Quattro triticale." Gerald then typed Kirk starts to look at Darvin, but then decides he just isn't worth it. Charlie Brill, the evil Arn Darvin, was a young man with a long acting pedigree. Let's go back to him. There he is. Let me take a drink of water again right quick here. Hold on. Okay. Brill said, quote, "I've been in this thing since I was 7 years old. I did Broadway. I did Peter Pan with Jean Arthur and Boris Karloff in 1950. I did a lot of dramatic live television in the 50s as a child actor." And then the child actor grew up to be a stand-up comedian with his wife and comedy partner, Mitzi McCall. McCall and Brill had the dubious distinction of following the Beatles when they appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show on February 9th, 1964. It was the most watched show on television at that time with an audience of 70 million, but very few were paying attention to McCall and Brill. Sullivan had the Beatles open the show and then brought them back for a second set with Brill and McCall and a handful of other acts sandwiched in between that the teenagers in the audience had no interest in. Brill calls it the Night of Terror and said, "A million preteen kids screaming all during our set, and Mitzi and I were standing next to each other and couldn't hear what we were saying. And that was messing up our timing. And we thought that the people at home couldn't hear, so we spoke louder. But that just made the kids scream louder and louder, 'We want the Beatles.'" Now, as for how he came on to Star Trek, Brill says, "Mitzi and I were Anne Margaret's opening act for many years. And then Mitzi became pregnant, so we couldn't do the nightclub sets anymore. Leonard Nimoy, who was a friend, said, "Why don't you come down and do my show? I'll introduce you to the people you need to meet." And I said, "What show?" And he said, "I'm on a show called Star Trek. Meet me tomorrow at Remember, this is in the second season, so it's not like it had been around a while. Meet me tomorrow at Paramount, and I'll leave you a walk-in, and then I'll introduce you around." So I went down to Paramount, and he left me a pass, and I asked for him, and they brought me onto the set. He said, "Come with me," and he brought me into a big office. And the man behind the desk looked at me and said, "Arn Darvin." I'm guessing this was Gene Coon. I don't know. Or maybe Joe DaGosta, the casting director. And I said, "Arn Darvin, what's that, a Jewish holiday?" And Leonard said about me, "Yep, that's Darvin, all right." And then the guy behind the desk said, "Okay, thanks for coming over." So I walked out of the office and I said to Leonard, "Well, that went nowhere." And he said, "You just got that job, you schmuck." And I said, "On what?" And he said, "On Star Trek. you're going to be in the next one." Brill would reprise the role of Arn Darvin more than 3 decades later for the episode Trials and Tribulations on Deep Space Nine. William Shallert would be cast as the uptight Nils Barris. There he is. He had just finished 3 seasons playing Martin Lane, the father on the Patty Duke Show. He was 45 and at this time had an infrequent recurring role as Admiral Harold Harmon Hargrade, the founder of Control on Get Smart. Yeah, I think I remember that. And of course, anyone who was around at this time, like from like the mid 60s and probably even earlier, 60s and 70s. I mean, you remember this guy. He was one of those character actors that just popped up all over the place on all different kinds of shows, on westerns, on comedies, etc. Whit Bissell was 59 when he played Mr. Lurie. I guess I don't think I have a better image of him than that one. 1 year earlier, he was a regular on Irwin Allen's sci-fi series Time Tunnel, playing Army Lieutenant General Kirk. No relation, one assumes. Paul Baxley played Ensign Freeman, and he was 43. Let me find him. Oh yeah, I think that's up here. Here we go. Okay, there he is. I don't know. 43 is a little old for an ensign, it seems like. He served in Hollywood as a stuntman and stunt coordinator with occasional actor for over 4 decades. During his career, he doubled for Marlon Brando and Darren McGavin, among others. Baxley also doubled for William Shatner on a couple occasions when Shatner's regular stuntman Dick Dial was not available. Among his Star Trek appearances, Baxley also doubled for John Fiedler in Wolf in the Fold. So, if you recall my stream on that one, I kind of laughed at that scene in Wolf in the Fold where what's his name? What's the character's name? I forget, but the investigator character, he goes berserk and starts attacking everybody, and it's just so obviously a stunt double, wearing a bald wig, and I guess that means that was Freeman. Let's see. He also played the Knight in Shore Leave and was one of the natives in the Apple. And he would return to the Enterprise as a crewman again for And the Children Shall Lead and Assignment Earth. Michael Pataki played Korax, the troublemaking Klingon who starts the barroom brawl. So let's see here. There he is. He was 29 and had been on television since 1958. He had just begun a 3-year recurring role on The Flying Nun as Roberto. He would work with Shatner again in 1982 on an episode of T.J. Hooker, and then also appear in the Star Trek Next Generation episode Too Short a Season. I wonder who he played in that. Ed Reimers, who played Admiral Fitzpatrick. Where was that scene? Where is this? Let me see if I can find that scene where he's talking to. This must be back earlier. Hold on. There we go. There he is. Okay, so he played Ed Reimers played Admiral Fitzpatrick. Reimers was well known as the spokesman for Allstate Insurance in the 1960s. In the ads, he would hold his hands out, palms up, and say, "You're in good hands with Allstate." So I don't know, maybe he was the first guy to do that. Maybe he was the first pitchman to do it. He would then cup his hands, and a small dollhouse would appear in them, or a small house. When shooting his scene for this episode, as he talks via video screen to Kirk, Reimers caught a Tribble tossed his way by someone off the camera, placed it into his hands, and said, "Oh, and Captain, you're in good hands with Tribbles." This gag would make it into the blooper reel at the end of the season and was screened often at Star Trek conventions over the decades. Yeah, I remember that. I remember seeing that. Now, George Takei was originally planned to be a big part of the Trouble with Tribbles, with Sulu handling much of the dialogue that would later be reassigned to Chekhov. Let's see, let's find Chekhov here. That's good enough, I guess. Let's see, but Takei had received an offer to appear in the John Wayne Vietnam War movie, The Green Berets, which was set to begin filming at this time. Without knowing that Star Trek would rerun well into the new millennium, Takei asked for time off. This was granted, with his leave of absence from Star Trek commencing on February 22nd, 1967, the day before The Trouble with Tribbles would begin filming, and scheduled to continue through October 4th, 5 days before episode 16 would commence principal photography. His absence would actually go on for much longer. More about that later, as the Star Trek company waits and then waits some more for the return of Lieutenant Sulu. As for the primary guest stars, the Tribbles, while Chang designed the fuzzy creatures, hundreds of them were made. Some staffers remember they were made from carpet, others from fur. Whatever the material, the task of making them come alive was given to Irving Feinberg and Jim Rugg. Quote, "Believe me, I had Tribble troubles," Feinberg said in 1968. "I had about 1,000 Tribbles made in 4 different sizes and 4 different colors. Some of them were fitted with balloons which could be inflated to make the Tribbles pulsate. Others contained motors which allowed them to walk around. For the larger Tribbles, Feinberg used battery-operated toy dogs. He would cut the heads off the dogs and then cover them with fur." Another cost-cutting move, the Enterprise miniature that is used in the shots with the space station K7, I guess where it appears in the background. This is actually a plastic Enterprise model kit by A&T. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, so that's actually an A&T model. Okay, production began Wednesday on August 23rd, 1967. Now, Gene Roddenberry was back in town at this point, and reportedly he was not happy with what he was seeing. Although less than thrilled about the shift Star Trek was making into comedy with this episode and also less than thrilled were Leonard Nimoy and Robert Justman. Others, Gene Kuhn and Dorothy Fontaine, as well as Shatner, Doohan, Nichols, and Koenig, were delighted to see boundaries being pushed. Joseph Pevney was also enthusiastic. And why not? After all, he had directed several episodes of The Munsters. Pevney even fought for the chance to push the envelope on Tribbles, getting the most out of the comedy sequences. Quote, "I fell in love with that one," Pevney said. "I really enjoyed doing it, and I enjoyed working with Leonard and Shatner to make them think in terms of typically farce comedy. The show was successful, and I was happy about that. I was proven right that you can do comedy if you don't kid the script and you don't kid Star Trek. If you stay in character, you can have wonderful fun with Star Trek, and the kinds of things you can do with it are endless if you don't lose the whole flavor of Enterprise discipline." And I think that's really notable because I think one of the issues with modern Trek, as with so much modern stuff, it has this kind of ironic sort of self-awareness where, they're kind of like winking at the camera and like, haha, isn't this all stupid? Haha, isn't this silly? And they kind of mock the characters, and it's hard to say or define, but as he says, you don't mock the concept and you don't mock the characters. You may have fun with them, but you don't make fun of them, if that makes sense. According to Gerald, Pevney was very serious about his comedy. The writer said, Joe Pevney was a nice guy, but very focused on the job. I talked to him one time and he just kind of ignored me. He was too busy, I guess. He never even said, hey, nice script, David. Whereas Mark Daniels, when he heard I was working on a script, said, do a good job. I got encouragement from him. Nothing against Joe. I think Joe's a terrific director. I thought he did a great job on Tribbles. I just never had much of a relationship with him, whether it was because I was coming across like a fanboy or whether he was just too busy. It could have just been me as much as him. Okay. Now I'm at an hour, 10 minutes already. Okay, let me skip a bit here. Okay. On day 3 of filming, so a rare occurrence took place on this day. So let me find this scene here. There we go. Okay. So on day 3, they were filming this scene. And James Doohan allowed himself to be photographed with his right hand fully displayed to the camera. The hand that is missing the middle finger at the knuckle. And you can see it's easy to overlook, but you can see it kind of down here. You can see there's a finger missing. And apparently this is about the only time you can clearly see his missing finger, or the lack of a finger, however you want to say it, in the series. Okay, now Charlie Brill. So at midday on the same day, they moved to stage 10 to film the scenes in Mr. Lurie's office. And let me bring that up. Here we go. I guess there was a good one. So Charlie Brill said, I hadn't seen the show. I didn't know anything about it. But I went onto the set and I saw the guys in wardrobe, so I knew it was a sci-fi thing. But that's all I knew. And then I found out it was a popular show. I love the costumes they were wearing, and I laughed at Leonard's ears. I pointed at them and laughed, and he was okay with it. He's among the nicest people on earth. Yeah, I'm sure he was thrilled. I liked Bill Shallard. We got along famously, and I hated the haircut they gave me. They cut my sideburns off and combed my hair forward, so I looked like a little kid. Where's a good? There he is. I couldn't wait for my hair to grow back. Brill was in many of the scenes filmed this day and the next. He recalls everybody was quite serious about their jobs, and everybody had a tribble. All the actresses had tribbles. They just kept petting them. They loved them. Everyone but me, so I had nothing to hold, nothing to do with my hands when they were filming me. If you look at both scenes where I'm with the Enterprise people, my arms are folded because those costumes didn't have any pockets in them. So my arms would have just been hanging at my sides. So I just folded them. I wish I could say I did that as an acting technique to portray arrogance. You can believe that if you want, but the truth is I just didn't know what to do with my hands. Concerning the Star Trek, Brill said, I loved what Shatner did in that episode. He plays comedy great. Leonard, of course, was brilliant, and there were laughs on that set. A lot of shows are too serious when they're being made, but not that one. We had a lot of fun. Now, let's see. Al Francis, the camera operator, said, quote, Bill Shatner and some of the others were clowning around on the set. Joe was having a little problem with that. And at one point, he really barked at them. He told them they were going to have to settle down and he didn't want any more noise on the set. I was looking through the camera at the time and I could see Shatner's eyes go over to him. Here's a guy who really means business and he'd better be quiet. I burst out laughing. Joe said that all the Joe said that all the people to start laughing when he'd gotten everything under control. And I'll tell you, it was hilarious because then everybody just broke up. I don't know. The way that's written doesn't make sense to me. Charlie Brill added, when the Tribbles come out of the door and fall all over Kirk, we were hysterical. One landed on his head. They did it in a perfect take. Okay, now for the brawl scene. Or actually, no, I'm sorry. It should be that other one. There we go. James Doohan insisted on doing many of his own stunts, and Pevney, unlike Mark Daniels, was agreeable to it. Quote, I did about 95% of my own stunts in that big fight scene, Doohan said. About 5% they used a stuntman where some flying through the air was involved. It took about 2 hours to film the whole thing once everything was lit. It was still a lot of fun to do. My stuntman, J. Jones, actually said to me when this was done, if I ever become famous, you can be my stuntman. Under Joseph Pevney's direction, Tribbles eased along and came in under budget and on schedule. Looking back on the experience, Charlie Brill said, when Mitzi and I were on the Ed Sullivan Show with the Beatles, John Lennon was in the guest room with me, and he was doing these doodles, drawing little cartoons on napkins, and he gave them to me. And then I just left them there. And then I was on the Tribbles, and everyone was taking Tribbles home with them, but not me, so I missed out on John Lennon's doodles and on some original Tribbles. Okay, now as for the Tribbles themselves, so for the kind of trilling noise they make, it looks like they actually did recordings of pigeons cooing. And that's where they got that. And then the noise where they kind of screech, where they make the kind of squealing noises, apparently that came from a screech owl, actually. And then the Case 7 model. Let's see. Come on. There we go. So the K7 model, apparently Gene Roddenberry got that model from Douglas Aircraft. Apparently they actually had built this model themselves for whatever reason. And somehow Roddenberry got a hold of it, and then they modified it a little bit for the show. Charlie Brill and Mitzi McCall were watching the night Tribbles aired on NBC. He recalls, we really liked it. We laughed. We thought it was great. I hated my performance, of course, but everyone else was great. And yes, we loved it. Now, although it's a very popular, beloved episode, it really didn't do that great in the ratings. So in the first half hour, it came in second. Star Trek was second. Of course, far behind Gomer Pyle as usual. But usually, it was running against Hondo on ABC, and usually it would come in like 2, 3, maybe 4 points ahead of Hondo. But in this case, it was just one rating point ahead of Hondo. And then in the second half hour, they were basically tied, actually a little lower. Hondo was 28.6% audience share, and Star Trek was 28.4%. Although they were both much closer, there was less distance between them and the movie. Usually the Friday night movie on CBS would be up in the 40s. But in this case, it was just 31.2. So I guess maybe an overall larger share of the audience watched, maybe. Okay, so Tribbles was nominated for a Hugo Award in 1968. Now, the second book that was ever written about the making of the original series, the first being The Making of Star Trek in 1968, was actually a book devoted to this episode. David Gerrold published The Trouble with Tribbles, the birth, sale, and final production of the episode in 1973. Cinefantastique magazine named Tribbles as one of the 10 best from the original series. Tribbles was voted the single best episode of the original series by viewers of Sci-Fi Channel's Star Trek 40th Anniversary Celebration. Star Trek 101, which was published in 2008, put this on the list of the 10 best from the original series. Not surprising. Yeah, I mean, pretty much everyone loves that episode. Any top 10 episode of Star Trek episodes is probably going to have this on it. Nichelle Nichols also liked it. She named it as one of her favorites. And then there were the sequels. First was More Tribbles, More Troubles in 1973 for the Star Trek cartoon series written by Gerald and featuring the series regulars as well as Stanley Adams returning to play Cyrano Jones, and Trials and Tribulations in 1996 for Star Trek Deep Space Nine with Charlie Brill returning to play Arn Darvin. Tribbles has stood the test of time, regardless the different opinions between the two Genes, Roddenberry and Kuhn about what Star Trek should be, we're about to come to an impasse. And I'll talk about that probably, I don't know, maybe the next stream. I'll talk about that some. Now, William Shatner said the trouble with Tribbles was so much fun that the trouble we had with Tribbles was keeping a straight face. James Doohan said the episode probably did the most since Wolf in the Fold to establish Scotty's character and dynamics. That one was a lot of fun. I love the scene where Kirk is trying to figure out if Scotty started the fight over love of his captain. It turns out that it was actually about the ship. All in all, David Gerald wrote a very solid script. Dorothy Fontana said, quote, whenever I'm asked what Star Trek episodes are my favorites, I always reply, The City on the Edge of Forever and The Trouble with Tribbles. Both stories are unique in that they show sides of Captain Kirk that were seldom displayed on the show. A sense of humor and a fine appreciation for the ridiculous, and a genuine growth of love and poignant loss. Walter Koenig said, it was very funny. I thought Bill was terrific. He played it perfectly. He really showed that he has a delightful sense of humor, and he could be very attractive that way. I remember his consternation of these things and how they were affecting his crew. It was a lot of fun. This was Joseph Pevney's favorite episode, but the director remembered that not all were happy over the good fun. He said, quote, we had done some comedic sequences in Star Trek, but this was the first out-and-out comedy we had done on the series, and Roddenberry was not in favor of it. He didn't cotton to the idea of making fun on this show. Samuel Peoples, who helped develop Star Trek with his teleplay for Where No Man Has Gone Before, said, quote, I thought that the one with the fuzzy little creatures wasn't my idea of what Star Trek should be. It was cute and awfully nice, but it covered an area that I felt was unnecessary for that type of series. Leonard Nimoy also didn't appreciate Tribbles at the time of its production. He felt it was frivolous. Jerry Finnerman was not a big fan of Tribbles either. 35 years later, after the accolades have been flooding in, he said, it was campy. You know, everyone talks about that show, but it was very campy. That's all I can say. Robert Justman said, I felt it went too far comedically, and it worried me about believability. I felt it was just a little too characterish. It worried me right up to the point that the show aired, and we got a response, and it seemed that everybody liked it. William Campbell said, after The Trouble with Tribbles was aired, I felt like, wow, because I got such a response from playing the Klingon. Even the neighborhood kids teased my wife about being Mrs. Klingon. People were writing to me about the eyebrows and the costume and the way I played the part. And I thought to myself, this captain of the Klingons would be a good adversary. They respect each other's abilities, even though they're adversaries. Now, apparently, Gene Kuhn had told Campbell that Koloth could become a recurring character and appear again. But that would not happen because, as Charlie Brill says, oh no, I'm sorry. So that wouldn't happen because Gene Kuhn would eventually leave the show. I think Roddenberry zigged when he should have zagged, Campbell said. He never should have allowed Kirk and Koloth thing to die. Charlie Brill, from the vantage point of 2013, said, I'm amazed at the loyalty of the fans. When I go to the conventions, I'm amazed that they know everything I said. They know everything I did. They know all about me. And I'm flattered. It's an annuity for the rest of my life. It was by the grace of God and by the grace of Leonard Nimoy that the whole thing happened. Okay. All right. So I'm at an hour and 23 minutes. So I think that's a good place to break it off. Now, for the next episode of Trek Talk, I'm kind of Let's see here. So the next episode in production order is Bread and Circuses. But I think what I might do instead is actually talk about Gene Roddenberry and Gene Kuhn and about the growing conflicts between the two of them instead of covering an episode. I would like to do both, but I mean, I think if I did that, it would be so long. It would get a little too long, I think, because I generally don't do these over an hour. So this is longer than usual. So maybe that's what I'll do. We'll see. It'll be one of those two things. Talking about the two genes or maybe Bread and Circuses. I'll have to decide what I'm going to do. But anyway, yeah. So I'll be back next week with another Trek Talk. Thank you to everyone who tuned in to catch the stream. Ragnar, thanks to you for stopping by, and happy Canada Day. Also, please do like the stream before you go if you do watch it, and also please do sub to the channel if you haven't already. What else am I doing here? I'll probably stream Sunday night as I usually do. I will try to maybe have another video, probably not going to be this week, but maybe next week, another video. And that one I think will be maybe top 5 DC villains for the Hulk. I think maybe we'll see. So yeah, I'll go ahead and sign off now. Again, thanks to everyone for tuning in. And yeah, so long to you, Gwagnar. Again, thanks for stopping by. Have a good night, folks, and take care.